Hey guys, Stockaholics, thank you guys for being here today. It's been a while since I've made a new oil tanker video, but Don is here because number one, I'm making a video, and number two, a lot has changed in the oil tanker space. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my thoughts around that. We'll go through some articles, take a look at some different things, and then we'll also take a look at some of the stuff I normally talk about, like the scrapping and the order book and then things along those lines. I wanted to take a quick look back to put a lot of what's exists today into some context. Where are we coming from? Last couple of years, we've had really low depressed oil demand. The reason for that, we've had a virus. There's been a response to that virus in various societies, countries around the world, where there's been an idea where we need to lock our citizens down, restrict travel. As a result, very low oil demand, right? And because of that, we saw that there was very bad rates for the crude for the past segment for the past couple of years. Although I think that we've seen a more balanced product tanker market. We did see as there were deliveries for crude, some of that was cannibalizing the product segment. But overall, I think you could make the case that the product segment has been doing a little bit better than the crude. We've also seen very high deliveries of ships, new ships hitting the market the last couple of years. This is largely because when the pandemic first started, the oil tanker rates were tremendous, along with the period before that in 2019, when there was the sanctions that removed a lot of tankers from the fleet, the Costco sanctions. And what do ship owners do when they make money? They go and buy new ships. Now, those ships have been slowly being built, and now a lot of those have been delivered in 2021, and a lot of those are being delivered this year in 2022. However, we also have seen high levels of scrapping the last year or so, and we continue to see some, which we'll show you a little bit later. In a low rate environment, the less efficient older tonnage gets scrapped. We have also seen there's been a lot of articles that say that the scrapping is quite low. I completely disagree with these articles because a lot of them are comparing that to the new deliveries. However, if you look at scrapping and compare apples to apples, you compare scrapping to historical levels of scrapping, we've seen some very, very high levels of scrapping taking place in the last year or so. We're also coming from a period of very bad sentiment. You could use my videos as a cue, the lack of or anybody talking about oil tankers. And we have also come from a period of very low oil inventories. We've been continually drawing on those inventories, and that has a lot of that has instead of translating to ton mile demand for oil tankers, instead a lot of that has been being drawn from crude inventories around the world. Where are we now? We have normalized and increasing oil demand. Again, a lot of the behaviors associated with the virus are over. Although you do see some problems in China lately where they're locking down their citizens. You're also beginning to see high levels of social unrest as a result of those decisions. So speculation, but I'd imagine that those behaviors should come to an end. Now, we have also seen lately there's been some very high rates for the crude and products segments. First, we saw the products their rates begin to increase. Shortly thereafter, we saw the crude segments increase. Both of the segments are very dependent on each other. They're in their supply chains related highly. There's a high correlation. When one moves, eventually you see the other one. Again, we still see those high deliveries this year in 2022, and we still see very high scrapping. One quick note on the deliveries: next year we have almost very low amount, and the year after that there's none to little. So the next couple of years there will be very low amounts of tonnage hitting the water, and we continue to see high scrapping. We still have a very old fleet. Even though the rates have begun to shift, the last week or so we saw, according to Compass Maritime, they have 5 or so Suezmaxes, right? We're also seeing improving sentiment. I'm seeing people talk more about the oil tanker segment. And we have dangerously low oil inventories around the world. You're beginning to see that manifest in terms of a diesel shortage. I have heard of jet fuel shortages taking place in the Western Hemisphere now. We're in the United States. All of this is interrelated, okay? And what all of this is going to lead to is these inventories going to be filled up wherever they can be. And we'll get into that in a second, but this leads to very high oil tanker demand. I wanted to share some points from this article on the potent tanker opinion. I think there's a lot of really interesting points. The article is titled "Living in Interesting Times." Okay, during the last 4 years, tanker freight rates have fluctuated wildly, ranging from extraordinary highs in late 2019 and early 2020 to the lows from summer 2020 onwards. The rate spikes for crude tankers in 2019 were driven by geopolitical events, much like some of the ones that we see now, in particular the attack on the Abqaiq oil facility in Saudi Arabia and the U.S. sanctions on certain COSCO companies. This COSCO sanctions event to me was a very significant event because it showed me about how many vessels need to be removed from the fleet to go from an oversupply of vessels into an undersupply of vessels. Recently, I've seen a slide from EURN saying that based on 2019 levels of oil demand and prior trade routes, which might be changing in the near future, there was an oversupply of about 60 to 80 VLCCs, which is about where I thought that, based on this event, about what you would need to see high rates, an undersupply of vessels. Okay, anyway. These events occurred in a tanker market that was already tight amid growing ton-mile demand and was dealing with the uncertainty around the implementation of IMO 2020. These are these environmental regulations. We have more of them coming, and they are going to cause more structural problems, in my opinion, in the tanker market. Okay. When the COVID-19 pandemic broke out in China, the initial reaction was understandably negative for the tanker market. And quick point on this IMO stuff. By problems, I mean those are good because it means that the rates are likely to increase. Okay, where were we? Let's see. However, the price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia in the face of falling oil demand turned the market on its head. The huge oversupply of crude oil needed to be stored in tankers, and then since then the market has been depressed. Okay, now there's some comments about the pandemic, but I think a lot of us are beginning to realize that the behaviors associated with locking down, those kinds of things, they're not sustainable. They're not solutions to the problem. Anyway, okay, down here, not to ignore the elephant in the room, the event that is currently driving rates to tremendous highs is the events happening between Russia and Ukraine and the responses to it you see around the world. On 24th of February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. This attack was followed by an avalanche of sanctions on Russia by the international community. Actually, to me, observing this event is quite incredible to see how many private companies without dictation from the government are deciding to make what are loss-making opinions or loss-making decisions to not deal with Russia when they really don't have to, it's very strange to observe. But anyway, while most countries initially avoided targeting Russian energy, the conflict did create a lot of turmoil in the oil markets. Tanker rates spiked, and particularly trades out of the Baltic and Black Sea, two of the main export areas for Russian crude. Rates softened after a few weeks until they began moving up again last week as the dislocations in the crude oil and refined product markets are starting to have an impact. The sanctions on Sovcomflot, a largely state-owned Russian owner, have also contributed to rate increases. Some of those tankers have been effectively removed from the trading fleet, right? Initially, the Russian sanctions benefited Aframax and Suezmax tankers, which were most directly affected. However, product tankers have also moved up significantly, and more recently, the laggard, which is finally beginning to change, Even VLCCs, which were lagging the market, have also begun to rise. The changes in Russian trade flows are likely permanent and should benefit future ton-mile demand. I think that that's a speculation. I don't know that that's true or false, but according Putin believes that the trading patterns that we are seeing now may be permanent ones. And if they are permanent ones, then we are in a massive structural undersupply of oil tankers. There's a lot of opinions I've been reading lately where there's one guy, Zoltan, and some other guys basically saying we're entering a new era where there's a bipolar world that's emerging, where there's no longer globalization, or another way to say that, we've reached peak globalization, and that the trading as a result of this new world order are going to be much more fragmented. If that is the case, if that is true, then this bull market that has begun in oil tankers will last. It will last for a long time. Now I'm going to say if, because I don't know that this is true or not. The war may end. The pain that is being inflicted on Europe, the self-inflicted pain as a result of all these, particularly Europe and some other places, as a result of these trade wars in response to the invasion of Ukraine, they may, I don't know how long, if and how long Europe will be willing to tolerate pain from these kinds of sanctions, my opinion. But they may be permanent, I don't know. The market would have probably improved more and faster if it wasn't for a new COVID scare in China. Lately, we've also begun to see riots in China as a result of these zero COVID policy. And, you know, can't really, maybe they'll keep doing that. But who again, another thing, who knows, right? China has a zero COVID policy that aims to prevent the spread of the virus through border controls and mass testings, quarantines, strict lockdowns, all ineffective. An increase in cases in the major commercial hub of Shanghai has caused officials to lock the city down of more than 25 million peoples. One last note over here, and this is something that I fundamentally disagree with on the article. Over the long term, the need to address climate change will reduce the use of fossil fuels and demand for tankers. This is a pervasive idea I've seen all over the place. I see it from the oil tanker executives themselves, and it is something that I personally I see as false. It doesn't make sense. As humans, as a species, whenever we have discovered an energy source, we have never stopped using it. If we're going to come together and try and solve this climate change thing, for me personally, I don't see it as possible, because in order to reduce oil demand without a sufficient substitute, what that really means is you're going to starve people to death. And I'm not supportive of that. In fact, I'm very pro fossil fuels, because pro fossil fuels means pro humanity. Now, I understand that there are problems with climate change and all of those things, and that the world is likely to get warmer. That is something that we all have to adapt to. But as it stands now, there is no alternative, right? And at the same time, you see more and more oil demand as a result of these countries that are improving their standard of living, these emerging markets. One thing a lot of people don't know also is that every incremental barrel of oil demand that you increase, the vast majority of that goes onto water. It doesn't travel through pipelines, and it makes sense, because where's incremental oil demand coming from? Developed world. Developed world doesn't have infrastructure. Where does that oil come from? By sea. Okay. Some quick notes in there for you guys, and my opinions on a lot of things. Now, the global oil supply chain, I'm going to admit, it's very complicated, and I have never really fully understood it. I've spent some time looking at these routes, spent a couple of hours here and there looking at all of these things, seeing trying to think about what would happen if you shut one of these down, or if something happened. But the way that I've ultimately come to think about this, instead of spending, thousands of hours trying to figure all this stuff out, is that under normal globalization, under normal conditions, what we have as it exists is somewhat efficient. All of these routes, especially when you have an oversupplied oil tanker market, you're going to have these vessels trying to take routes that, for the most part, are the most efficient, right, to travel to get from goods from point A to point B. Now, occasionally you've seen that there's dislocations in certain markets, but those get filled quickly, right? When you see, like, let's say you see a spike in Mediterranean rates for whatever reason, vessels come from somewhere else. They fill that gap. They fill that need, right? But if you have an event like this Russia-Ukraine war, and everybody says, you know what, we're not going to take Russian oil anymore, that throws a massive wrench into this supply chain, right? It's a lot like what you saw in the container market with COVID, right? When we first saw all that stuff down, and we saw these lockdowns, and you saw ship crews getting stuck at sea or at port or wherever, and you also saw at the same time a huge demand surge in terms of goods. Huge shock in the supply chain, right? A similar thing is very likely to occur if this Russia stuff continues, and if the behaviors in response to that continue. It's just like when you throw this wrench in this machine, it goes from a efficient, well-oiled machine to a mess, and that mess is very good for oil tankers and any shipping segment. Another way you can think about this wrench that's being inserted into this machine, if Europeans continue to go down this route, Europeans in particular, there will be a tremendous demand for oil tankers in the near future. We've been hearing a lot of talk about sanctioning crude oil, natural gas from Europe to Europe from Russia. A lot of this stuff comes through developed infrastructure, through pipelines. If you do not receive these from Russia, they need to be sourced from elsewhere. That doesn't suddenly mean that you're going to stop using this stuff, right? Instead, it's going to come from another source through sea. Based on the amount of ships in the fleet, the oil tanker fleet, if you were to suddenly say that you are not going to take any of this oil anymore, and instead you're going to put this through the ocean, through seaborne ton-mile demand for oil, you need a lot more tankers. We need way more tankers than currently exist. Now, it gets worse in terms of this wrench, and this isn't something that too many people are talking about yet, but I have a hypothesis that at some point in the future that they will be. One of the things you've heard in the container ship market, which has been raging for the last couple of years, one of the themes you hear is that there is a lack of infrastructure, right? Historically, we've gone from smaller container ships to larger and larger and larger vessels. And as a result, a lot of the ports, when you saw a surge in demand, were no longer able to accommodate those huge vessels, or not all the ports were able to accommodate those massive container ships, right? Likewise, we're seeing a lack of infrastructure in a different way in refineries around the world. One of the trends you see in the West, United States, Europe, Australia, the people who tend to most be obsessed with climate concerns, you've seen a disinvestment in refineries. And instead of those, a lot of those crude products being refined in the West, they're being refined elsewhere. And instead, a lot of products are being shipped to those locations. For example, Australia, they recently shut down, I think, all of their crude oil production in Australia and are fully dependent on product tankers. So it causes a massive dislocation, increased ton-mile demand for product. But they're related because you have to get that crude oil from somewhere else too. And this is something else that people don't realize, is that there's different kinds of crude oil in the world, right? So if you have a refinery that's specifically tuned to producing a specific or refining a specific type of crude oil, and you remove it from the supply chain, there's untold consequences that can happen in the future as a result. Huge ton-mile demand increases, right? And with a lot of the things that we hear with Russia, well, we're not going to import Russian oil anymore, right? Well, a lot of the refineries that we have set up in different places are designed for Russian crude oil, to refine it, right? So if you're not going to refine Russian crude oil anymore, where are you going to get another kind or the similar kind that you can refine in your refineries? Or if not, you're not going to do that, where are you going to source your oil and your products from? And it just throws a massive wrench in this supply chain. And that's why I suspect that when people begin to realize this malinvest or lack of investment, or another way you can say is malinvestment into other industries, there can potentially be huge consequences, and those huge consequences are tremendously beneficial for oil tankers. I want to quickly show you guys scrapping, something I've been talking about for a long time. So far this year, we've seen 1 VLCC being scrapped, not great, but we've seen 6 Suezmaxes, 5 recently, which was interesting to see because Suezmaxes have been doing okay, or pretty good this year so far. And to see that many ships being scrapped kind of gives you an indication of how old that fleet actually is, if you're still seeing scrapping during high rate periods, right? And then we've seen Aframaxes. If it continues as it is so far this year, you'll probably see similar levels of scrapping this year. We may not though, because rates as they are now, again, are very high. Okay, I wanted to close by taking a look at this slide. It's a slide from EURN, and this kind of shows why I have been interested in this space, and it hasn't been because of global conflict, okay? In 2003 to 2008, there was a tremendous super cycle in shipping. As a result, oil tankers did tremendously well. As a result of that, they ordered a tremendous amount of ships. Now, a lot of the ships that were built during that last super cycle are approaching 20 years of age. The effective lifespan of a 20-year-old vessel is, well, 20 years. That's about how long it lasts, right? Now, there's a lot of vessels that in the coming years are going to have to be replaced, especially the 2008, 9, 10 built vessels, right? And at the same time, there is not an availability in shipyards to build them. Okay. At the same time, we have increasing environmental regulations where these older vessels, the older they get, the less efficient they become relative to the new eco vessels, right? Because you have this spread between different fuel types, the VLSFO and the LSFO, right? And as a result of these environmental impacts, it effectively makes the fleet even tighter, okay? And the only way to replace this fleet that we've built during the last super cycle is for rates to be tremendously high for a tremendously long period of time. There is not investment coming from outside sources. There will be when the rates get very high, but it currently does not exist, right? At the same time, there's a problem because with the very high rates we've seen with the container ships recently, the berths in these shipbuilding yards is completely flooded with all of these container ships, okay? Now, the amount of ships that these shipbuilding yards is not static, okay? Eventually, the amount of vessels that these guys can produce will increase. But as it stands now, this industry has been much like commodities and shipping and all of these things has been chronically underinvested in too. And so we've seen a tremendous contraction in this industry. The amount of ships that they could build as a result were designed around the bear market. Now, again, this is going to change because there will come capital into this. These guys will make tremendous amounts of money. They will reinvest it into their business. And over time, you will see the amount of ships that these shipbuilding yards, the amount that they can produce, it will increase over time. But this takes a very, very long time. You think about what goes into building a ship. You need a place to build it. You need a whatever you call them, these terminals, these berths. You need skilled labor. You need guys that can build the ship. You need materials. You need steel. You need engineers. You need all kinds of things. And a lot of this space has a lot of the people that were the skilled people that were involved in the space, they don't exist anymore. So you need to get those, you need to produce those, and that takes a tremendous amount of time to get that kind of that kind of special skill and knowledge to come into that space. So this is the investment case, why I've been so bullish long term for oil tankers and some other segments too, by the way, which, you know, similar effect in the bulker space, right? So right now, everybody's talking about Russia. For me, this is what I'm looking at. Have a great day.